Though in the days of quill pens, elaborate italic script, and clerical secretaries more attuned to a medieval pace in the office, this may not have been quite the quick-witted intellectual juggling feat it initially appears. Aquinas also spent a large amount of his time at the Curia drawing up preparations for the union of the Catholic Church of Rome with the Byzantine Church of Constantinople. This was a project cherished by many popes. Intricate negotiations took place, compromises were mooted, detailed documents were drawn up, and on occasion meetings even took place between the two parties, but all to little avail. The Catholics were far too Byzantine in their approach, and the Byzantines remained incorrigibly Byzantine. Aquinas was not the only great philosopher to play a leading role in attempting to unite Christendom. In the 17th century, the German philosopher Leibniz was instrumental in an equally doomed move to unite the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches. By then, Byzantium had long since been overrun by the Turks. Among the great philosophers, Aquinas was unusual in playing a major role in the practical affairs of his day, and doubly unusual in the fact that his peers took this role seriously. Leibniz's plans were a highly sophisticated work of genius, far too subtle to be taken seriously. Aquinas adopted the Aristotelian attitude to politics, that is to say, a pragmatic approach which at least had a chance of working. When Aristotle had drawn up a new constitution for any city-state, his first criterion had been whether it could be put into practice in that city-state. Only then would he attempt to incorporate all the best features from the constitutions of other city-states. Aquinas did on several occasions draw up a series of skillful compromises between the practices of the Western and Eastern churches, but negotiations were hamstrung by the interested parties' profound antipathy to the first principle of politics, as understood by both Aristotle and Aquinas, and precious few political philosophers before or since. All attempts by Aquinas to smuggle this principle into the negotiations were confounded. Aquinas's political practice was undeniably practical, but his political theory was just as undeniably theoretical. For Aquinas, the state was the perfect society. But the state could not be too oppressive, because the rightful moral aim of man in this life is human happiness. This may be vague, but at least it is anchored in Aristotelian common sense, and it is even fairly serviceable as a general principle. Unfortunately, Aquinas was far too much of an intellectual to let such vagueness stand. He now introduced an element of Aristotelian thought whose flimsy attachment to common sense in ancient Greece had worn somewhat threadbare over the centuries. One of the tenets of Aristotelian metaphysics was that the part is adjusted to the whole in the same way as the imperfect is adjusted to the perfect. So, as the individual is part of a perfect society, the law must be concerned with human happiness, because in a perfect society we should all be happy. This argument bears thinking through in some detail, as its steps and implications are admirably subtle. But when all is said and done, it introduces no new element of clarity to the original vagueness which it set out to dispel. Fortunately, Aquinas' skills as a political theorist were never misapplied to reality. His practical skills as a political operator, however, were much appreciated and frequently in demand. Late in 1268, Aquinas was hurriedly dispatched on an important mission to Paris. Once again, the university was in a turmoil of controversy. The dispute between the Dominicans and the university authorities had reopened. At the same time, recent translations of Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle were leading to dangerous radicalism. Aquinas had the difficult task of defending the Dominicans while defending his belief in Aristotle from attacks on all sides. The traditionalists considered that recent developments were compromising orthodox beliefs and placing the entire Christian interpretation of Aristotle in jeopardy. The Averroists, as the radicals were now called, had fastened once more on the old division between reason and faith. According to them, these represented two entirely different forms of knowledge, namely religious knowledge on the one hand and scientific rational knowledge on the other. In their view, the knowledge of faith and the knowledge of reason were utterly independent, and could even contradict each other. This revolutionary split, which still runs beneath the surface of our thinking today, was correctly seen as a direct threat to the intellectual dictatorship of the Church. Aquinas continued his defense of theology as a science of reason based on revealed religious principles. But this sanctioning of the autonomy of reason, even within the boundaries of faith, led many traditionalists to condemn him along with the Averroists. Apart from all this, Aquinas also had his work cut out trying to defend the Dominicans. Much of the underlying cause of these struggles was political rather than purely intellectual, but fortunately Aquinas had some powerful allies. Not least of these was Louis IX, King of France. Louis IX was in many ways the exemplar of a medieval monarch. A muddled, well-meaning man, he ruled France for more than 40 years. He enjoyed intellectual company. The founder of the Sorbonne was a close friend of his, and bright clerics such as Aquinas were regular guests at his dinner table. Louis achieved renown throughout Europe for his unprecedented diplomatic behavior. He actually kept his word, and even conformed to treaties he had signed, practices as rare in the 13th century as they are in the 20th. Louis was also an avid builder of churches, his most famous being Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which he built to accommodate an extremely rare relic given to him by the Emperor Baldwin of Byzantium, Christ's crown of thorns, of which there were only 3 genuine originals at the time. But Louis is perhaps best remembered for his crusades. In 1248 he set out on the 6th Crusade. All went well until 1250, when Louis was defeated and captured at Al-Mansura in Egypt. He was held in Syria for 4 years, while the usual negotiations for the release of Middle Eastern hostages got underway. Louis's release was finally agreed in exchange for a colossal sum of money, a king's ransom no less, and the surrender of all the territory he had gained on the crusade. After this, many thought that Louis's crusading days were over, but within a few years he was busy planning another one. He finally set out for the Holy Land once more in 1270. Unfortunately, he caught a fever not long after disembarking from France and had to be put ashore at Tunis, where he died. 27 years later he was canonized, and is now famous throughout Missouri and for his blues. King Louis had great respect for Thomas Aquinas. One of the few credible anecdotes about Aquinas relates how he went to a ceremonial banquet given by the king. As the king was talking, he was suddenly interrupted by one of his guests bringing his fist down with a crash onto the table. The hall fell silent, and all turned to stare at the large, pot-bellied cleric responsible, who appeared to be unaware of the disturbance he had caused. Deep in thought, Aquinas muttered to himself, "I have it!" The king leaned down the table, unused to being interrupted in such a fashion, and demanded an explanation. Aquinas came to himself and looked about him. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," he apologized, "but I have just realized how to refute Manichaeism." Louis was so impressed by the blundering, otherworldly cleric that instead of reprimanding him, he ordered Aquinas to continue with his meditations, and dispatched a secretary to take down his refutation of Manichaeism. This quasi-Christian heresy, dating from the 3rd century, believed that the world was a product of the conflict between good and evil, or light and darkness. The human soul consisted of light, entrapped by darkness, from which it must seek to free itself. The profound simplicity and coherence of this core dualistic doctrine, which echoed pre-Christian Mediterranean cults, made Manichaeism prevalent throughout the Mediterranean world, from early Christian times until well into the medieval era. In the 4th century, St. Augustine was a Manichaean, before his conversion. Aquinas refuted Manichaeism by denying its dualism. Evil does not exist as a positive entity. It is merely a lack of properly informed good. Even when committing the most evil acts, we always have good in mind, even if only our own. The psychology of this would seem irrefutable. The murderer sees the death of his victim as good. Even the unwilling torturer conforms because he considers it better to do so. The fact that our view of good is mistaken is what makes it evil. Despite being intellectually routed by Aquinas and actually routed by less intellectually minded opponents, the Albigensian massacre and so forth, Manichaeism obstinately persisted until well into the 15th century, and possibly beyond. Indeed, recently uncovered historical evidence suggests that it may even have been covertly imported to the New World by early settlers. But Aquinas had more to do in Paris than refute heresies over dinner. He had been sent on a mission. As part of his campaign to defend the Dominicans and resist the inroads on Aristotelianism by the firebrand Averroists, Augustine wrote a treatise. This he called De Pestifera Doctrina Retahentium Homines a Religionis appears. Aquinas also spent a large amount of his time at the Curia drawing up preparations for the union of the Catholic Church of Rome with the Byzantine Church of Constantinople. This was not the only great philosopher to play a leading role in attempting to unite Christendom. In the 17th century, the German philosopher Leibniz was instrumental in an equally doomed move to unite the Roman Catholic and Protestants. Was a project cherished by many popes. Intricate negotiations took place, compromises were mooted, detailed documents were drawn up, and on occasion meetings even took place between, though in the days of quill pens, elaborate italic script, and clerical secretaries more attuned to a medieval pace in the office, this may not have been quite the quick-witted intellectual juggling feat it initially between the two parties, but all to little avail. The Catholics were far too Byzantine in their approach, and the Byzantines remained incorrigibly Byzantine. Aquinas was not